Count Corley, I'm a sort of a political nerd when it comes to the finance bill, because I'm fascinated by the way the finance bill in particular, year after year, provides a mechanism to transfer the wealth generated by society and by working people generally into the hands of the very wealthy in a sort of opaque manner where working people for the most part don't know the details of how they're being robbed of the wealth that they collectively produce. So I sort of play a game with the finance bill every year, which is find the tax relief that's going to benefit the rich, and then maybe find the sneaky tax that's going to punish the poor. It's a game I would strongly recommend that people who are concerned about injustice in society learn to play, because they would learn a lot by examining these opaque mechanisms through which the very rich and big business effectively rob the poor by not paying fair tax contribution on the enormous wealth that they produce through profits, which are generated by working people who do pay their taxes and have to pay their taxes because they're taken directly out of their pay packet every week and every month. But for many of the very wealthiest people who own some of the biggest and wealthiest companies, they effectively write their own tax bill and finance bills year after year, either through omission, because they fail to look at tax reliefs that were given in previous years, or through provide a new mechanism for the wealthy to not pay tax. Now, that's the main thing I really want to talk about in terms of the finance bill and specific instances of that. I should mention some of the kind of highlight measures which are a bit more obvious, were spoken about a bit more, but most of that ground was covered in the main budget discussion. If for no other reason, we will be opposing this finance bill because of things like the carbon tax, which is just, the increase in the carbon tax, but, the latest in a long line of regressive taxes which are imposed on ordinary people, punishing them often on the grounds of protecting the environment, which we had with bin charges, with the attempt to bring in water charges, but which in fact are just ways of regressively taxing working people for things that are not their fault and that are actually the fault of other people. And that's what, of course, the carbon tax does. The net effect of the $7.50 increase in the carbon tax this year will cost ordinary people probably about €60–70 a year additional. But you see, when it comes on €60–70 every year that we increase the carbon tax up to the targets that are proposed, what you have is a slow chipping away of the income of ordinary people, disproportionately hitting the poorest, as a substitute for actually taxing the polluting corporations that do the real damage. So we don't want to tax them. In fact, we go out of our way to make sure they don't pay taxes by providing them with a multiplicity of tax breaks. So because we won't do that, we've got to tax the person who, for example, I don't know, is living in a council house where they're not even allowed to retrofit their own house. If they wanted to, they're not allowed, because you're not allowed to do that. So you can't do anything to reduce your energy bills until the council decide to retrofit your home. But nonetheless, you are now going to be punished with an additional cost for your energy expenditure in terms of keeping your house warm. Or you're going to be punished for the fact that you can't afford an electric car. A wealthy person can afford an electric car, a brand new electric car, but if you don't have the money for that, you're now going to be punished for it. And you'll be progressively punished year after year. So I think that's one reason why we'd be opposing it. The other thing just to mention, of course, a major issue in this is the wage subsidy scheme, and while of course we welcomed and supported the measures to support people's income, to maintain a relationship with their employer, to keep people in that relationship, what we don't, and it's an interesting contrast actually with things like Debenhams, when we're looking for 10 million for the Debenhams workers to get their 2+2, we can't get it, right? It's too much to ask, it'll set desperate precedents and all the rest of it. But when it comes to giving the wage subsidy scheme to, for example, Boston Scientific, which is a major multinational company, produces medical equipment, which was fully were operating during the pandemic, but they benefit from the wage subsidy. Hugely profitable, because essentially they fiddled around with their manufacturing process to be able to qualify for the 25% reduction thing, and as a result benefit from the wage subsidy scheme. Or more generally, a whole range of quite profitable companies, and don't get me wrong, Minister, I support any measure to keep people employed and for the government to support their employment and maintain their relationship, but there should be oversight over the cash reserves of these companies, their ability to contribute to top-ups. Are the CEOs and executives of these companies paying themselves massive salaries? Were they operating offshore in order to avoid tax? All of those sort of oversights, which were not imposed on many very profitable, wealthy companies that benefited from the wage subsidy. So I'll just highlight that. But back to my favourite game, if you like, the find the tax benefiting the rich, and there seems to be a couple that I've noticed. One was mentioned earlier on about the Section 48, which provides a partial refund of stamp duty where land is developed for residential purposes, and extends out from 24 months to 30 months the period in terms of the completion of construction by which they can benefit this. Now, in simple lay person's terms, that's a tax benefit for landholders and land speculators, and people profiting already very handsomely from the inflated housing market that we have, which benefits property developers and indeed gives us the other effect, which is a wider social housing crisis in terms of the lack of affordable housing and public housing and so on. There's also a Section 23, which I don't really understand, I haven't time to go, but providing for capital gains tax relief to individuals who dispose of assets of a qualifying business or shares in a qualifying company if they've owned these for a period of 3 years and a 5-year period and so on. I won't go into all the detail. We can probably do that at committee, but that seems like another tax giveaway to the haves as against the have-nots. And then you just add that to the litany of tax reliefs and allowances that allow the very big wealthy corporations, the huge, some of the wealthiest corporations in this country, who've seen their profits double over the last 10 years from about €80 billion gross profits if you go back to about 2008 up to today, 2020, where they're making about 180 billion gross profits before tax deductions, but then they only pay tax on about 90 billion of that because there's 90 billion worth of tax loopholes which they avail of. Things like the research and development tax grant, intra-group transactions, tax relief around amalgamations, which is another big one. A lot of these are detailed in this very interesting list that is produced by Revenue, which I always wave about every year, which has all these tax reliefs, which amount to about 20–30 billion euro a year. And in fact, interestingly, the one I've highlighted for the last few years, intra-group transactions, which is the way big multinational corporations essentially write down their tax bill by saying they owe another subsidiary of their own company money, and then therefore they don't have to pay tax on those profits. That heading on this little Revenue piece of paper has changed and disappeared, right? Because I suspect because I keep highlighting it, and so it's now gone, and it's sort of merged into a few other headings. Something interesting in this regard, I think, is worth pointing out. If you take some examples of companies who have all these subsidiaries, Pfizer in this country, for example, has 27 subsidiaries in Ireland. Johnson & Johnson has 23. Merck has 23. Abbott Laboratories, 13. Thermo Fisher Scientific, 8. Gilead Sciences, 7. Boston Scientific, 6. Eli Lilly, 6, and so on. Loads, a network of subsidiaries where they organise their tax affairs, basically by paying each other loans and money and royalties and all the rest of it, so that they end up paying little or no tax. I haven't got time to go into all the details, but I just think it's a scandal. There should, every single year at the budget time, we should be looking at all of these tax reliefs, examining every single one, looking at who's benefiting and seeing what benefit, if any, is actually going to Irish society. Very little. I just want to conclude with Section 481 tax relief, and this is something I want to pay tribute to the Minister, because he has genuinely listened on this and made changes, genuine changes, to try and ensure that film production companies who benefit from about €80 million worth of tax relief, Section 481 tax relief, in addition about €20 million that they get from Screen Ireland every year. That's 100 million. Think about the last 10 years, that's about €1 billion gone to the film industry. But how many people actually have jobs in the film industry, like actual jobs, permanent jobs of any description? Maybe 50 if we're lucky. At one stage, the people who get all this money were coming into the Oireachtas committee and saying there were 17,000 jobs, when we actually said that wasn't true. There was nothing like 17,000 jobs, and finance looked into it. They discovered there was actually about maybe 2,000 jobs, and all of those jobs were completely, effectively sort of, they were like the Strumpet City jobs, where you'd go down when the film was set up and say, any chance of a job? We don't really like you, you don't get one. That's how the film industry in this country works. Nobody has a pension, nobody has any basic entitlements in terms of continuity of service. So you can work in the Irish film industry for 20 years and you can be blacklisted tomorrow, as some people have been, because they actually highlight these matters, and you're gone. Absolutely nothing, but we hand out very large sums of money every year, about 100 million in total each year. Now, don't get me wrong, I want money going into the Irish film industry. I want it. In fact, I wouldn't have a cent less going in, but I believe it needs to be tied to absolutely ensuring that there's proper employment, decent contracts, pensions and so on for the workers who work in that industry, and there's a recognition of their service and the years that they've worked in that industry, something that doesn't happen. And just in that regard, I just want to, in my last 30 seconds, say to the Minister that there's a number of the big production companies in this country who, even according to the revenue figures on how much they get, we're told they get 10 to 30 million on a production. Now, that is probably a breach of the EU rules in terms of reporting state aid, to say, did we give them 10 or did we give them 30? We're not quite sure, but this is public money. Right, that's unacceptable for a start. But these same companies are going into the WRC literally in the last few weeks, saying that they have no employees. It's a DAC who has the employees rather than the company who receives the money from. So even despite the reforms you brought in, Minister, they're still playing the same game of trying to hide behind the DAC and not actually take legal responsibility for their employees. That has to stop. It has to stop. And I would appeal to you to look further into it, about how these companies are saying one thing on a declaration they're supposed to sign for you to get this relief, and saying another thing when they go into the WRC.
Deputy McBarry.